Hello everyone, thanks for joining me. This demonstration will focus on simple ways to create smooth shading. Something I'm not going to be covering in this demonstration is blending. There are times to blend graphite, but many beginning artists make the mistake of over-blending. It's important to master good shading techniques before learning to blend. I will be producing a video that covers a range of different blending techniques for both graphite and charcoal. Also, smooth shading takes time. The drawing I produced for this demonstration took me about 3 hours to complete. There are times artists prefer to shade very quickly, but the focus of this demonstration is on the basics of shading smoothly. Here are 3 simple rules for achieving smooth shading. Number 1, keep a sharp pencil point. This is because most drawing paper has something called a tooth. This just means that if you would look at the side of the drawing paper through a magnifying glass, you would notice that it has ridges and valleys. The purpose of this is to catch the graphite as you shade. If you have a dull pencil point, the graphite only hits the tops of the ridges, creating a very rough look to the shading. However, a sharp point gets into the valleys of the paper, creating a smoother look to your shading. There's actually a little trick to keep your pencil sharp so you don't have to sharpen it every minute. I'm sure you've noticed before that many drawing pencils have 6 different flat sides to them. If you turn your pencil to a new side every so often, it'll help your sharp point last longer so you aren't constantly sharpening your pencil. Number 2, use small moving strokes. Okay, so small strokes is easy enough to understand, but what do I mean by moving strokes? Well, let me try to explain. Many beginning artists make the mistake of shading in columns. Notice how the areas where these columns overlap are darker and create a pattern. Instead, you want to move your pencil around as you shade. Here I'm using side-to-side strokes, but I'm moving my pencil around in sort of a circular motion so that those strokes weave together and create less of a pattern. For even smoother shading, you can use circular or oval strokes, moving the pencil around as you shade. One last method I'll show you before we move on is a way to shade a bit more quickly while still creating a smooth look. It's called a pendulum stroke. With this method, you swing the pencil down and back up like a pendulum, and it lightly strikes the paper. This keeps the edges of the strokes light so that they weave and blend in with successive strokes. It's a way to fill in larger areas more quickly. Now rule number 3. Build values from light to dark. Notice how I'm not trying to get a dark value by just pressing really hard with my pencil. You will have to adjust your pressure at times when you shade, but you still want to gradually build up dark values by layering the strokes. Pressing too hard will flatten the tooth of the paper and make your darkest values reflect light, which defeats the purpose of using dark values. Now let's talk about the drawing pencils. I'm sure you've noticed that drawing pencils have these letters and numbers at the top. The most common letters are H and B, and they usually have a number in front of them. There's also something called an F pencil that we'll get to a little later. The letter H stands for the hardness of the pencil lead, and the letter B stands for the blackness or softness of the lead. It's easiest to think of these numbers and letters like a positive and negative scale. In the middle is an HB pencil. Moving to the left of it, we have an H, 2H, 3H, 4H, and so on. The bigger the number in front of the H, the harder the lead, and therefore the lighter the stroke, assuming that you're applying the same amount of pressure. The purpose of these pencils is to create extremely light lines. They are great for drafting, architectural drawing, and linear perspective drawings. That F pencil I mentioned earlier fits right here between the H and the HB. The F stands for fine. This means that it has a harder lead and can be sharpened to a fine point. Now, moving on to the right, we have the B pencils, which are most used for shading light and shadow. As the number increases in front of the B, the lead gets blacker or darker when the same amount of pressure is applied. For this shading demonstration, I'm using an HB, 2B, 4B, and 8B pencil. The HB and the 2B are for my contour drawing and my high key values. 4B I use for my middle key values. The 8B I use for the low key values. It's easier to use a harder lead for light values and a blacker lead for dark values. But this doesn't mean that you can't shade dark values with an HB or shade light values with an 8B. In fact, I often use an HB pencil to shade over top of dark values I've shaded with an 8B pencil, because the harder, sharper lead of the HB actually blends the rougher shading of the 8B pencil. Okay, before I demonstrate shading, I need something to draw. I found a seashell and a clothespin that should work for this demonstration. I selected these objects because they are a good progression from the previous video I posted called Basic Value Structures for Beginning Artists. In that video, we looked at the effects of light and shadow on a cube and a sphere. Here, I have an object with many flat sides and planar values in the clothespin, and an object with many rounded surfaces in the seashell. Originally, I planned to talk a bit about composition in this demonstration, but I realized it would add too much additional time, so I will save that for another video. Just let me say this. I arranged these objects in about 20 to 30 different ways before settling on this arrangement. The point is, experiment with your compositions so you can find the most interesting one to draw. Okay, let's get started. I hold the pencil far away from the point so that I can get very light lines. I sketch in the basic shapes of the objects. The clothespin is simplified into a 3D rectangle. The outer edges of the cast shadow are drawn. Then I lightly sketch in the very outer edges of the seashell and its cast shadow. Now I want to stop here for a minute and describe some of the things I'm focusing on as I'm drawing. Right now, the last thing I want to focus on are details. So I'm lightly sketching in the large basic shapes. This enables me to check the following things while I still have a chance to correct them if I need to. First, I can make sure that the objects are the correct scale compared to the size of the paper. I don't want to draw the objects too small and leave vast amounts of blank space around them. Second, it helps me to make sure that the proportions and spacing of the objects are correct in comparison to each other. I use a technique called sight sizing to judge some things such as the angles of the edges, the relative vertical locations, and the width and the height of each object. I also look at these important negative shapes to accurately draw the objects. I'll be discussing the use of sight sizing and negative space in another video demonstration. The third thing that sketching these outer edges enables me to do is to make sure that my composition is balanced. There are some proportional inaccuracies in the sketch, some of which are on purpose. I made the clothespin shorter and wider and elongated the seashell a bit to conform better to a horizontal composition. Also, I pushed the horizon line down further so it lines up with the top third of the paper and makes the highlights of the top of the clothespin stand out more. Lastly, I pushed the objects a bit to the right side of the paper to leave room for the cast shadows, which I plan to emphasize. The objects actually appear to be facing in that direction as well. That activates that space a bit more. Now I begin to sketch more specific contours. I'm still holding back far on the pencil so I can draw lightly through the edges of the forms. Don't make the mistake of focusing on details first when you begin a drawing. Oftentimes when you do this, you find out that your proportions are terribly inaccurate when you're far into the drawing. It's always a good practice to draw from general to specific. Now I change the grip of my pencil to get a bit more pressure as I draw more precise contours of the objects. I make some corrections as well, such as reducing the thickness of the clothespin. It's a good thing that I kept my initial sketch very light. You can see how I'm creating this object from a simple rectangular form. It's almost like I'm gradually carving it out of a block. This is a good mindset to have when you're drawing synthetic or man-made forms. Now I begin to draw the interior contours of the shell, which is a series of these irregular rings or spirals. I emphasize some of the edges that cast shadows in the horizon line, and I'm ready to begin shading. I start by adding in value for the background above the horizon line behind the top of the clothespin. I use linear pendulum strokes to darken around the top of that shape. First, I just shade in the direction of the edges to fill in some value. But then I go over these with horizontal strokes to darken it further and add depth. Horizontal strokes help to give the illusion of depth as opposed to vertical strokes, which tend to look like an upright form or a wall. Remember, the advantage of this technique is it allows you to fill in large areas of value more quickly. By swinging the pencil down and back up, it keeps the edges of the strokes light so that you can more easily blend and weave them together. Here's another little trick that works well for creating edges with shading. I use a piece of notebook paper as a stencil to establish an edge, like I'm doing here with the border of the paper. To emphasize a crisp edge on the clothespin, I start my pencil right on the edge of the form, then lighten the pressure as I create the stroke away from the object. This is a little trick that helps me to control the pressure and gradation. It's a technique that I'll use on the cast shadows as well. Even though I'm using long strokes to fill in the large background area, I'm not trying to rush the shading. This takes me some time, which is why I've increased the speed in the video. To achieve smooth shading, you must layer and build values gradually. Now I begin to lightly shade down into the area of the tabletop below the horizon line. By creating a subtle gradation or a soft edge along the horizon line, I hope to create a sense of depth. I keep most of the shading on the left side of the paper to show that my light source is coming from the right side. I'll indicate my light source for you. With the background finished for now, I decide to begin shading the seashell. I start with the shell because I want to work left to right. That's because I'm right-handed. This way I won't smudge over areas of the drawing that I've already shaded. I place a piece of notebook paper under my hand so I don't smudge the drawing underneath. Another reason for this is it keeps the oils from my skin from getting into the paper and influencing the look of the shading. You always need to keep the paper clean so your shading will look its best. I start at the very tip of the seashell. I notice that each of these rings or spirals contain highlight, core shadow, and reflected light, just like we see in a simple sphere or cylinder. The entire bottom of the shell contains an area of reflected light. You can see that as I start to shade in the cast shadow. I make the cast shadow darkest near where the object is touching the table, and then I gradate it to a lighter value as I move away from the shell. A tip for shading rounded forms is to start in the darkest areas where you don't have to worry as much about the pressure you're using. Then work your way out to create gradation, lifting the pressure as you go. Now back to those shading methods I discussed at the beginning of the video. For the background, cast shadows, and also for the clothespin, I'm mostly using a pendulum stroke. However, on the shell, I mostly use circular strokes, which helps me keep the shading even smoother and helps me to achieve that look of a shiny surface. Throughout the drawing, I use these two methods together. For instance, in the cast shadows, I use linear pendulum strokes to fill it in, and then I go back into it with circular strokes in the darkest areas to achieve a nice, rich, low-key value. So here I'm beginning my shading in one of the most complex areas of the composition. It's important not to lose sight of major value groups, high key, middle key, and low key values. It's easy to get lost in tiny details, so I have to keep checking these major value groups. Notice that even though each ring in the shell has its own range of values, you can still see how the high key, middle key, and low key values line up on the overall form at the end of the shell. That's because the whole shell at this end is shaped kind of like a cone. Now I begin to shade in some of the surface texture and pattern in this area of the shell. Don't worry about drawing every little texture in detail. Be selective about what textures and details to include. Students often ask me what the secret is to drawing and shading texture. My quick answer is close observation and patience. Really, texture is just like shading bigger forms, but on a much smaller scale. All that texture is just a result of light and shadow, but on tinier forms. So the first thing to do is observe closely. Then patiently shade what you see. As you can see in this drawing, most of the texture occurs along this area of the shell where there is a transition between light and shadow. This area is called the terminator. Now I begin to shade the light side of the shell. Notice that I shade lightly around the highlight so it stands out and creates the effect of a somewhat shiny surface on the shell. Now that I've shaded in the texture, I'm going to shade back into the darkest areas of the form shadows, especially the core shadow along that area of transition from light to dark. Now I shade the cast shadow from the shell. Underneath, where the shell and the cast shadow come close to touching, I try to keep a soft, out of focus edge. I also include an area of softness around the outer edge of the cast shadow. This is called the penumbra. Now that the seashell is mostly finished, I start shading the clothespin. This will be much easier to shade. As I mentioned before, I mostly use linear strokes to shade it. I keep most of the strokes vertical to create a contrast between it and the horizontal strokes of the background. But I also use some smaller circular strokes to achieve the darkest values and to shade some small details. I shade it especially dark near the top of this shadow side, so it contrasts with the lighter background. Since this is a flat-sided form, it has planar values. That is, each flat side is mostly one value. However, there are still subtle variations of values on each side. One thing I want to emphasize on the clothespin is the shininess and the roundness of that metal spring. Even though it's small, I include highlight, core shadow, and reflected light on its surface. Now I start shading the cast shadow. Again, I start in the darkest area right up next to the form. I use linear strokes and lighten the pressure as I work away from the object to achieve gradation from dark to light. Something I want to point out on both objects are these areas where the cast shadow and the objects meet. Notice how the value gets so dark in these areas that it's difficult to tell which is the shadow and which is the object. These are called occlusion shadows. Now I work on the lightest sides of the clothespin. I decide to make the very top sides the lightest and keep them practically white. These will be the high key planar values. I add some shading to the right sides of the object, making it just a bit darker where it meets the plane of the top sides of the clothespin so that I can emphasize that edge a little bit. The right sides of the form will be a middle key value. After some finishing touches, I'll be finished with this drawing. Let's review some of the basic value structures I talked about in a previous video and try to find them in this drawing. We have cast shadows. We have planar values, especially in the clothespin. We have highlights in multiple places. We have multiple core shadows and many areas of reflected light. Let's also review some of the rules for smooth shading. Number 1, have a sharp pencil point. Number 2, use small moving strokes. Number 3, gradually build darker values by layering your shading. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you decide to join me for more demonstrations. Thanks for watching, and have a blessed day.